Hello everybody, this is Atul from IT Codes. Here with the fourth lecture of your Angular, we will be learning Angular data binding. What data binding is, what is string interpolation, what is property binding, event binding and two-way binding. So in this lecture, we will be learning all four types of binding your data from your TS file to your HTML component. So let's go into the lecture and learn how to use data binding. So let's start with what is data binding. Now in simple words we can say data binding equals to communication. In your components, Angular components, you will have the TypeScript code, which is the business logic, and the design template, which is your output HTML. So in simple ways, data binding is communication between your business logic and your design template. There are four ways. First, we already have seen in our first lecture also, but we will again go through it to get the better idea. That was known as string interpolation. We used to write using this two curly braces and the variable or the property name. So that is known as string interpolation. When you want to output the TypeScript variable to your HTML, that is termed as string interpolation. Second is property binding that we will be learning in this tutorial. Third is event binding. Now when event binding comes into picture, now when you are having some HTML and you are having a button, supposingly we need to fire some event which is inside your TypeScript code, that is inside your business logic, using that button, then the binding which is done is known as your event binding. And the last way is known as two-way binding, in which the binding will be vice versa. That is, you can have the value from your HTML in your TypeScript and from the TypeScript into your HTML. That is termed as two-way binding. So these are the four ways of binding your data, which is known as data binding in Angular. Now let's go through it one by one and see the practical way of implementation. Now in last we had something as menu component which we called in the last lecture, and we got the output as this. You got the custom component and styling inside your last lectures. Now for doing the data binding, we create a new component in all. So I open another terminal window. I use the command as ng generate c and the component name as data component. So here is your data component created. Now we remove the default text which is printed inside, and we write a text as new employee with name, and supposedly this is a placeholder where we need the dynamic data from the TypeScript, and ID again a placeholder. So this is the default text. Now I run the application. Let's add the data component to the app component to call it. To save, and the text with your placeholder is displayed on the page. Now what we want to do is we want this content to be dynamic. So for that we create two variables inside your data component.ts file. We define as employee ID equals to, I assign a value as 101, that is a numeric value. Employee name, I give my own name and I save it. Now in string interpolation, what we have to do is we just have to replace the placeholder with starting with two curly braces, ending with it, and the variable inside it. So the name is employee name and ID employee ID. You save and refresh. So you get the dynamic data from your TS file. This is known as string interpolation. Now this was the first thing which we saw in your previous lecture also. So this is well known to you. There is one way more with your string interpolation. Supposingly, instead of the variable, I want to bind a method to this particular place. So I create a method as a function as get employee ID I just give as return this dot employee ID. Now instead of the variable employee ID, I pass the function over here which we created right now. Get employee ID. We save it, the same output. You get the employee ID, but right now you are getting the employee ID from the function. So in string interpolation, you can either bind the direct variable from the TS file to the HTML, or you can bind a value which is written from the function itself. So this function is returning the string, and that string is binded inside your page. So this is your string interpolation. Now the next part which you want to learn is property binding. Now how property binding works? For property binding, first and foremost, we create a button over here inside your HTML. So give as input type equals to button. Value, we give a text as add employee. So a button appears on the page. Right now nothing is happening because there is no event binded to it or anything. It is not doing any action, but still it is clickable. Now what we want to do is we want to disable this button. So there is a property named as disabled. Now when you just pass disabled property inside your button, you will find the button is disabled. It is not clickable anymore. But this is fixed. This is a fixed property which is passed from the HTML itself. With your property binding, what we want to do is we want to bring this property dynamically from the TS file. So for that, first and foremost, we define a constructor over here. In that constructor, we use set timeout JavaScript method. Set timeout has the action which you want to perform and for how many milliseconds, or after how many milliseconds you have to fire that particular function. So I want to do it after 2 seconds, so I specify as 2000 milliseconds. Now over here we write a syntax as this assigns to a function. Basically this is an EJS function. It is same as this function, and we define a function and write over here. It is same way, but it is an EJS syntax. So over here we define as this, and inside it what we write is this dot, we define a variable over here first, allow employee add, and we assign a value as false over here, which is right now already there inside your HTML. Also we have disabled it over here. So default value I give it as false over here. Now inside your set timeout event, we say this dot and employee equals to, we make it true. So what this would do, the constructor will fire when the data component class has been loaded. So initially the button is disabled directly from the HTML itself, but after 2 seconds it will automatically be enabled. So let's see it. Okay, we have to bind that button over here because right now this is the fixed value. What we want to do is we want to bind the dynamic value which has been provided over here. So we, for the property binding, the syntax which we have to write is, we have to give the property in square bracket. Remember what we are doing, we are giving the property inside your square bracket, and we are assigning the particular variable which is created inside your TS file, allow employee add. But the condition what we have again is over here is that first it is false, and after some timeout it has to be true. So the condition has to be reversed, that is not. So if it is false, then this will be disabled, or it will be true. So let's check it. We refresh it. First it is disabled, after 2 seconds it is getting enabled. You can re-see it, refresh, after 2 seconds it is getting enabled. So this is known as property binding. Now what we did is, we defined a property variable over here. In this case we want to enable and disable. So for enabling and disable we have to pass the values true and false. So we define the variable as false first. In the constructor what we did is, we use the set timeout JavaScript method, and after 2 seconds we turn the variable value to true, and for assigning that particular value we use property binding. We binded that particular value of the variable to the property named as disabled, which is the property of the button. So this is known as property binding, the second way of data binding. It is pretty clear. So now we jump on to the third portion, the third, which is known as event binding. Now what we have to do is, we have to have a button over here which we already have it, and then we have to fire an event which is inside your TS file. So for that, first and foremost what we do is, we take another variable, we make it as employee status. In employee status we just give a text, no employee added, and to bind that particular value to the front end, we have to bind this particular employee status inside your front end. So inside your HTML we give it as, we define a p, and we use normal interpolation, string interpolation, and we bind employee status. So by default the text return comes as no employee is added for now. Now we take another button, fire an event. So first and foremost, we type the event inside your data component. On employee add. You can give any name. This is easy to remember, so I say on employee add, so it makes you understand that this event is for adding your employee. I will change the variable over here, that is this dot employee status equals to, I change it to employee added successfully. We have to bind this method to a button inside your component HTML. So over here in JavaScript, we used to have function as on click, on blur, on change. So over here also the events remain same, that is on click only, but for writing it we don't have to write as on click, we have to just write as click. So that is click event of the button, and which event or which function you want to fire using that method. So that is on employee add. Now as I save and again see, you find that the event is fired. So this is known as event binding. Binding an event from your HTML button to your component. So the component TS has that event, and that event has been called using that button, using that click event of that button. This is known as event binding. This is good. Now the other way of event binding which we want to see, that we want to bind an event from the HTML over here and we have to give it to the component file. So this is event binding over here. Now for that we define another function inside your TS file. Give a method as on update name. We define another variable as name over here. We keep it blank over here right now. We pass event over here, object of event, and type should be any. For using this particular method, what we do is we define an HTML inside your HTML, that is we define an input box inside your HTML. Here I say input type equals to text. The normal text box. Now as we have a click event inside your button, the text box will be having your change event or input event, on input change, on typed. So that is the event named as input. So I have given as event as input over here equals to your function name which we created was on update name. So define as on update name. There is some spelling mistake, I guess. Okay, we have to pass the event over here. That is the object of the event. So whenever we will be typing something over here, this event should fire. So first and foremost, to check whether it is working or not, what we will be defining over here is we just console it right now, dot log event dot target dot value. So this particular event will be targeting this new text box which we created. So once you type inside your text box, this is your text box, to check the console, we go in inspect and we go inside console from here. So as you type over here, you can see the console is outputting that particular value. So that value is binded over here. Now you can see that the value property is been binded as we type. As we type first character, the event is fired for that many times. Now let's go inside your component file and we change the event a little bit. Instead of any, what we pass over here is event, and over here we're doing event.target.value, but we have to assign it to the name variable property which we defined above, which is blank right now. So we just say event dot target dot value, but now it is giving you an error. So for this, what we will have to do is the event target, it is not matching this particular value. Why? Because the event target is an text box itself. So for that, we have to typecast that thing, and over here we have to write as HTML input element. So we explicitly typecasted it to input element for that. So now it's working fine. So our event.target.value is been typecasted to HTML input element, and it is assigned to the variable as name. Now to print that variable, we again have to go in component, and below the text box, what I do is I create another P, and using interpolation we can print it directly. So that variable is name, so I bind the variable as name over here. Now over here, when you type, you will observe it is binding over here automatically directly on runtime. This is again binding your text box value to the variable inside your TS file. So this is also known as event binding. Now this is known as one-way binding right now. Right now we are inputting from your text box, that is a front-end HTML, and binding the data inside your TS file, and again the TS file is returning the value. But there is one more easier and better approach which is known as two-way binding, which needs ng model, and inside your ng model you can bind that particular data. So for using ng model, we just comment this text box for now. I copy that text box again, I paste it over here. Now what we change over here is, instead of calling that function in your input event of your text box, we use ng model. Now for typing ng model, the syntax goes this way: ng model equals to the variable name. Now remember, for using ng model, in your first lecture also we saw that this won't work if you don't have forms module loaded. So remember, when you want to use two-way binding using your ng model structure, then you have to include the forms module inside your app module.ts file. So once you include it over here, this won't give you an error. So now your text box is binded. So this is again, you can observe that this is working same as you can see. Now you will find that what is the difference. So for that, we uncomment this thing, the above text box. Now we observe there are two text boxes. If I change the value inside your first text box, you can see that the value is changing both over here and over here also. That is, this is binding using your ng binding, that is ng model two-way binding, and this is from your ts file. Now the variable which we kept blank, that has no value in the initial stage, so we define a value over here. Now you will observe the change. You can observe it is binded to the ng model text box, it is not binded to your first event text box, the normal input event text box. So when I type over here, it changes everywhere, in the text box also and in the ts file also, and it returns on the html also, but the initial value which was binded is not binded over here. Now supposingly if I change in the second text box, you observe it is not binding inside your event text box. So this is known as your two-way binding. So for using an approach of two-way binding, you have to use as ng model, and you can bind the data from the HTML to the TS file and from the TS file to your HTML file. So these are four kind of bindings. First was your string interpolation that we already saw from the first lecture. Second was property binding, that will deal with the property directly, property of HTML. For writing that particular property binding, you have to write the property inside your square bracket, property of your HTML inside your square bracket, and you can assign a value which is inside your TS file. Third was event binding, simple event binding from the HTML to the TS file. So you fired an event on click of your button, and for writing that event inside your button or any component of your HTML, you have to write it inside your round brackets, that is normal brackets, round brackets, instead of the base JavaScript as we used to write on click, on blur. We don't have to write as on, we have to just write the event name and the function name which you want to call. So when you click this button, that on employee add event is called, that is over here. So this is firing your event from inside your TS file. The second which we saw was binding your value from the component TS file to your page using your input box. So in that we use then event as input event of your text box, but this was also not two-way binding. Two-way binding only occurs when you use ng model. So ng model occurs over here. So when I say ng model and we give the variable name over here, so that is binded from the HTML to the TS file and again back from the TS file to the HTML using this event method. So these are all your four methods of event binding. Now in next lectures we will be jumping on to directives, how to use and implement your directives. Thank you.